Who we have speaking today is, he graciously consented to donate his time and expertise here, is Jeff Smith. Jeff Smith lives in a community on LaGrave that's called Koinonia House. Is that how it's pronounced, Koinonia House? And if you get on the website for Koinonia House, you'll see photographs, many photographs inside of a greenhouse, and a variety of people starting seeds over a variety of years. Would those be some of the photos? And it was from that I thought he might be the perfect person for this today. So Jeff is going to lead this discussion based on his expertise of 25 years in this urban community, sustainable community here in Grand Rapids, and he's going to focus that on starting seeds, since that might be where some of us are focusing right now. Anything else, Jeff? Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure if I have any expertise necessarily. I haven't been doing this, but if anybody tells you they have expertise in seed saving, they're not telling the truth. So none of us are experts at it, except maybe certain indigenous cultures around the world who've been doing it for millennium. It's sort of a kind of a lost art, but it's really important that we do this for a variety of reasons. First, I think it's just economically it makes sense instead of having to buy seeds all the time if you save your own seeds. Because there are fewer and fewer seed companies. In the last 10 years, there used to be about 250 sort of seed companies that had catalogs that you could purchase from. Now it's down to just a few dozen. And part of the reason for that, and the biggest reason why it's important to save seeds, is because seeds have increasingly become more hybridized and more affected by genetic modification. So we're losing sort of our genetic heritage with seeds, with fruits and vegetables. There's a recent project in the Netherlands where they actually have an underground seed bank that's sort of, impervious to all kinds of stuff, even supposed to be impervious to like nuclear radiation or whatever. For that purpose, to be able to save so much diversity of seed stock so that if something ever happens and then people need to start over, there would be a seed stock we could save. So it's really important we do this. So I thought we'll talk about different techniques and sort of reasons why, and I brought some seeds from our garden. So Sarah's right, I live for actually 26 years in this collective on LaGrave. So we have our own greenhouse, and we have a pretty good-sized urban garden for urban spaces, and we've been saving seeds from the beginning. And I actually learned to do that from my grandmother, who was particularly saving tomato varieties that she got from a coworker who was from Sicily. So there are people who obviously been doing those kinds of things intergenerationally, which I think is really important. But more often than not, it's just been more convenient for people just to go buy the seeds that are in those nice displays this time of year if you go into Myers or Flowerland or wherever you go to buy seeds. But the problem is with most of those seeds is because of the genetic modification and because of the hybridization, many of those seeds themselves are not reproductive, meaning that they'll germinate, but the seeds that they produce won't regerminate. They're dead seeds. It's what's called a terminator gene. It's designed that way because most of the seed companies are also owned by Monsanto and Cargill and just a few large multinationals for the purpose of then you having to keep buying seeds. So that in itself is a whole issue. But the other thing that's problematic about that is if your seeds cross-pollinate with these kinds of seeds, they tend to overwhelm heirloom seeds. So it's just something also to think about. So that's where we'll start actually, is thinking about before we actually save seeds. So how many of you here are gardeners? Okay, so maybe half the room at least looks like. How many of you currently save seeds? Okay, fabulous, fabulous. Okay, and how long have people been saving seeds? Okay, other people? 2 years? Okay, gee. Here's my plant. Right, yeah. In the back, you had a couple years, okay. Anybody else longer than that? 15, fabulous, okay. Your whole life, okay, fabulous. Well, you should probably be up here then. And so folks have been doing it for a long time. If you have other techniques or suggestions, please jump in on this. So it's really important when you think about, before you even get to the saving seed part, is like, where you're growing stuff. So think about the whole issues around cross-pollination and diversity in planting. Yes?
So where do you get your seeds?
There's a couple entities that I'll suggest when we get to that sort of in terms of if you want to purchase stuff. But we're also working with a local group called Our Kitchen Table, and Lisa Oliver King's in the back of the room, with the idea of trying to have a seed bank locally so that people could both take out of and put into. So we have a pretty decent stock of stuff now, but we'd obviously like to expand that, make it more formal, because it sort of operates very informally. So that would be one hope for outcome, that we could do that on a local level. So again, where you plant stuff and how you plant them is really important in terms of not having stuff cross-pollinate. So what's people's experience of, like, say, let's just talk about peppers for a second. How many people plant peppers? Okay, how many people plant more than one variety of pepper? Okay, and how many people plant maybe more than 6 varieties of peppers? Okay, yeah, we plant like 10 in our space, which is not easy to do because they can cross-pollinate really, really easily if you're not careful. So I'm just going to pass around packets. These are, I think there's 6 or 7 different varieties of peppers that we grow. And just in looking at them, just to see if you can tell there's any like fundamental difference in how they even look. Pardon me? I actually brought a lot of extra collard green seeds, heirloom collard green seeds, and I brought extra bags if people want to take those. Okay, all right. Well, okay. Yeah. So it's just really important that you provide enough space. How many people have their own beehives or anything for pollination purposes? Anybody? Okay. I mean, obviously it's widely helpful if you have your own, because having your own beehives actually not only for pollination purposes, but it actually limits the amount of cross-pollination that happens if it's your own hive. Because if you have insects or bees coming from a variety of sources, it increases the chance of cross-pollination because they might be bringing something from somewhere else. But obviously, since most of us, how many people live outside of the city? Okay, all right, so you have a greater chance of having, not that you can't, legally you're allowed to own them in the city, but it's just obviously a lot harder for people to do that. So it's important to think about that in terms of, and then where you plant them. And how many people who grow rotate crops? Okay, good. Rotating crops is also a really important thing for seed diversity and seed saving. I mean, it's good for the soil, it's good for a lot of reasons, but it's also good in terms of seed variety to make sure that they stay hardy. So if you're planting the same thing in the same place every year, it also could tend to sort of weaken the resiliency of the seed stock of what you're growing. I would highly recommend, if you haven't, this book, which also comes from Seed Savers, which is one of the companies I would advocate. It's just called Seed to Seed. So the whole book is just basically a how-to, if you will, on ways of both saving, storing, drying, hanging. I mean, all different kinds of mechanisms to do that. And I'll pass this around as well if people want to take a. It's published by the Seed Savers themselves, which is based out in Iowa. And it's a huge farm in Iowa, and all they do is heirloom seeds. And that's their commitment, is to both, I mean, they grow a lot of food that they sell and so forth in the local communities, but they're growing all heirloom seeds, and they're constantly getting new ones. So they have hundreds of different seed varieties that you can get, both for vegetable, fruit, herbs, and flowers. And they do huge conferences every year in the middle of the summer. It's a camp out, so you can go camp there for the conference. And then their keynote speaker this year is actually Vandana Shiva, who, if you're not familiar with her, I would really recommend her because she's done a lot of writing herself about seed saving, and we'll talk a little bit about an entity that she's a part of in India that's working on seed saving issues. So, okay. So in terms of just some practicalities about seed saving, I mean, obviously some things are a lot easier to save than others. So the peppers that are going around are a whole lot easier because, you know, when you open up a pepper, there's a ton of seeds in there and it's not messy, right? Which is fundamentally different than trying to save seeds from tomatoes, right? Which can be messy. And so the way you sort of dry them also shifts. So with peppers, the thing that's important, obviously, is just you needing a sort of a dry, cool, not well lit sort of space for drying. So in other words, you don't want to have seeds drying in full sun because they can germinate in that process, and you don't want that to happen. You want them to be cool and dry, so there's not a whole lot of humidity, and obviously dry to keep the humidity down as well for drying purposes. If you dry seeds at all, you know probably it's best to, for every variety that you save, to have them dried on a separate platform. So some people will use like hard plastic or plexiglass. Some people will use plywood or wood surfaces. Some people might use styrofoam plates, paper plates, napkins. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can sort of dry them on, but it's good to not dry more than one variety of seed on the same surface unless you're going to, you know, really clean it off really, really, really well. Because they have a tendency they'll even if the seeds sort of come in contact, or if you just get seeds mixed together, they can that can cause problems for you.
Is there a best?
You know, we've used a lot of them, and I don't know that there's like one that's best. I mean, it's going to depend on what kind of surfaces you have available, right? I mean, what kind of flat space you can sort of.
Well, anybody can go buy it.
Sure, but like then where do you put them afterwards, right? Well, like where for them to dry. I mean, we have a sort of a large sort of multi-tiered table that we dry them on. So there's like it's like almost as big a surface as this, and it has like several tiers that we sort of then can put them on. Again, it depends on how many you're going to do. If you're just going to do a little bit, then, you know, the top of your refrigerator or something like that might also be useful. Yes, in the back. Yeah. There are some commercial seed drying, you know, apparatuses you can purchase, and I've seen some models, some blueprints for them online to build your own. I've never tried that, so I don't really know how effective they are. Has anybody else tried anything like that in the room at all? No? Okay. But then the things that are in terms of that are messier, like tomatoes. So there's several ways you can do like tomatoes, because obviously when you try to scrape out seeds from the tomato guts that are with it, I mean, some people will just do that, and this is actually how my grandmother did it. She would just do that onto like a paper towel, folded several times. So it would just soak up all the juice, right? And then after a few weeks, you could sort of then peel off the seed from it and put it in a separate sort of container. But you can also do things like put that stuff, all the tomato guts with the seed, in, say, like a small mason jar or other kind of glass container with a little bit of water in. And it's what they call fermentation seed saving process. So what will happen is that eventually there'll be a separation of all the guts, the goop, and the seeds. The seeds will sort of separate from them. And it usually takes a 2-week process for that to happen. It just means that when it's easier, then when you separate them, there's not all this stuff attached to it, and then they'll dry a lot easier. That's another tool with tomatoes. A third one that we've tried that I've seen other people do as well is if you have, a nice strainer, or even have like a tea strainer, right? Put it all in there, and then just sort of run a sprayer under the faucet to sort of wash all the goop through it, and then you're just left with just seeds. And then to put that on, a flat surface or the drying surface you're going to use. That's another technique to use. That's really useful. Yes.
When you're
No. You can cover it with something, but there has to be air. You don't want it to. Right. Yeah. So some people will, and we have a couple of these, and this is something we're hoping to create more. And I think, again, they're commercial ones you can buy where it's like a rack that's maybe, yay high. It's only about it's a square rack, and it has just screen, like screen they would use on windows or doors, real fine screen, layers sort of on it, so you could do multiple different kinds of seeds on that. Not stuff with all the goop and everything, but just what's left over, just with just the seeds for drying, because you don't want stuff dripping down. It's nice because it's efficient in terms of space, so you're not just laying everything out flat that way because you're doing it up. And I've seen people who've made some of those. They're not. I don't. If you have some carpentry skills, they're not that difficult to do, and it's not that expensive.
In the fermentation? Or a warm place?
It's always best for any of these to be in a cooler. It doesn't have to be dark, but just not in direct light. You just don't want it in direct light. Is what you don't want. Direct, natural light.
But cool.
Cooler is always better.
And when you say cool?
I mean, the less humid, the less of that, the better in terms of the drying process will be. I mean, obviously, if you're in late July and early August and it's, Michigan humidity, it's kind of hard to avoid that completely. But if you have a room that doesn't get any direct sun, can be useful. If you have the house I live in, we have a good traditional Michigan basement, so it's just cooler down there. It's nice to hang out because it's cooler in the dead of the summer. And it doesn't get any direct sunlight down there either. So those are options. I mean, we also have kind of a pantry that doesn't get any direct sunlight. It's another place we can put stuff. But as long as it's not in the sort of the direct sunlight, that's what's key. Okay. With other kinds of seeds that are not as evident, I mean, this is one of these things about growing up in this culture with not having much relationship with our food, the growing of our food, that people not being aware of, like, when do seeds come, where are they on certain things. So if I ask people, like, if you're going to save broccoli seeds or kale seeds, how do you know you're going to have seeds with kale, like a kale plant? Somebody, I'm sure there's plenty of people know, or broccoli plant. Pardon me? Right. So can you say what that is for people who don't know the term? Okay. All right. So, right. So it gets those yellow seeds, beautiful yellow flowers on them, Then the flowers will die and the seed pods will grow from that. And the thing about those is that you want to harvest them when the seed pods are brown, not when they're green, if you can. I mean, if you have green pods that are still going and all of a sudden you're getting ready for a really hard frost and you're like, I don't want to lose them, you can literally pick the whole plant up, uproot it, and hang it like in a garage or some kind of storage spot like that. Just hang it upside down, and they will eventually brown. Once all the moisture gets out of it. But it's obviously best to wait for it to brown on the stem, because then you know that the seeds are fully mature. So with anything like that, broccoli and kale and cauliflower and even radishes, you just want to make sure that before you start picking those things that they're not still green. And you can tell, you can even feel if the seed's fully mature or not within that. So again, the drier the better. And usually the easiest way to do it is just snip the stem, with some shears or something and bring them in the house and I always just put them in paper or plastic bags and sort of just crush them all and then cut a little hole in the bottom of the bag, and the seeds will all leave and all the chaff will not leave. So it's just an easy way for it to separate the chaff from it. Many indigenous cultures, particularly women in indigenous cultures, use what they call a winding technique, where they'll put them on a flat or like a blanket or a tarp or in a big wicker basket, and they'll just whack those things until they separate, and then they literally toss them in the air, and the seeds come back in the basket, but the wind takes the chaff and separates it. So it's a really beautiful technique. If you ever, you could. I mean, any of us could do the same thing, but that's particularly a lot of people around the world. Women will do that, particularly with like legumes and seeds that are a little heavier. So you can do those with all kinds of beans. Another technique then obviously is just for stuff like, okay, so what about like zucchini? What do you do with zucchini? I mean, besides make everything you can think of with zucchini when you're sick and tired of all the zucchini that keep coming, right? But how do you deal with seed? How do you get seed from zucchini plants, right? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Tomato.
Well, but again, it's a little different here, right? Because you pick tomatoes when they seem ripe and they're ready to go, right? I mean, and the seeds are mature. But the difference with like a zucchini or a cucumber is that usually when people pick zucchinis, you don't like the ones that look like, you know, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? These huge things you could club people with, right? They don't, because they're tougher, they're more fibery, right? I mean, you can still eat them, but they're just, you know, it's nicer when they're smaller and they're just more tender and they're sweeter. So it's always good to let a few get really, really big with cucumbers or zucchini or other kinds of things. Just let them overgrow. Even if they start to rot, you know, that's fine. Because then you know you have mature seeds in there. Because you all know if that happens, right? And you let stuff go, you get, you know, what we always call volunteer plants next year, right? I mean, they'll just seed themselves. You know, you didn't plant them. It's like, oh, that's great. So, I mean, you know, so plants like that have those much larger seeds, it's easier because obviously they're easier to see, but you have to let them just become grossly overgrown if you want mature seeds. If you know, the size of a cucumber you would get or any of those kinds of things and you slice it open, I mean, there are seeds in them, but they're just not mature. They're real thin, they're almost translucent, they aren't going to produce anything. So you have to for those kinds of plants, you have to let them go to the very end. The same thing can be said with any kind of squash, whether you're going, you know, acorn or butternuts or any of those kinds of things. I mean, generally they're mature enough that when we eat them that those seeds are usually good, pumpkins and so forth. But it's always good to let a few just go beyond sort of the time that you might want to pick them so that you make sure that the seeds are really mature. The same thing is the case with corn. So you don't pick corn while it's fresh, you know, like if you're eating sweet corn, if you want to save seeds, you have to just let it on the stalk until the seeds actually get hard, you know. Then you know they're mature seeds that you can use, that you can replant the next year. Any questions at this point about any other particular vegetables that you're, in terms of ideas about like how-tos? Yes. Yeah. It's a mild. It's not hot or sweet. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. That's one we got from the Seed Savers years ago. I mean, I just like to eat them off the plant because they're not too tangy, right? No, they're kind of a little bit like a big banana pepper, like really fat at the top, and then they get thin as they go down, and they curl a little bit. They're an interesting. They're mostly green, but if you leave them on the plant, if you eat long, they'll turn red or sort of even a kind of a burgundy color sometimes. But they're really hardy. They grow. They're really prolific. So we grow them a lot, mostly for what we use them for when we can tomatoes and salsa, just to have peppers in them, you know, fresh peppers in them. It is an heirloom, yeah. Yes.
How about seed?
Yeah. I mean, again, there's lots of schools of thought on how best to do this. I mean, you know, because you can buy, as you said, buy seed potatoes, but you don't need to in order to grow potatoes, right? There's lots of ways you can. Potatoes are really great because they're very self-regenerative. You know, I mean, obviously what we always call the eyes, right? They're already working on reproducing themselves all the time. So some people will actually chop potatoes up, you know, and to start new ones. It all depends on what kind of varieties you want. And again, I think it's important to think about that because there are some that are genetically modified, particularly the bigger potatoes, the russets, the ones that we're importing from out of state. But you know, Michigan has a pretty good diverse potato stock here, so it's better to, if you're, you know, I think they're better eating potatoes than not, but than the, you know, the Idaho ones and that, because those are really designed for more mass production. Yeah. You mean like green beans or? Yeah. Well, I mean, because it's heirloom doesn't necessarily mean it's pure. I mean, there's always been some evolution within seeds. I mean, I don't know anybody would say that these are like haven't changed. Right. I think that the resiliency of like green bean and pole beans is much higher than, you know, sort of the dry bean, you know, black pintos, northerns, all those kinds of things, and mostly because there's been more genetic modification in the hard beans than the like the pod beans that we would eat. But you know, growing like pintos or black beans or whatever, and you know we've done some of that, but you need a lot of space if you want to get a sizable harvest. And who has a lot of space unless you live out of town, right? The good thing about doing that, we grow them anyhow, not so much because we're going to get a huge harvest, but because of the nutrients they put back in the soil. So we always plant them. We do. We plant them with corn because it helps put nitrogen back in the soil. That the corn really depletes stuff. So I mean, we harvest some. Maybe we'll get a few pounds or something like that, but that's not why we're growing them. It's mostly just to benefit the soil. So, yes.
Potatoes?
Yeah.
Do you think it's a good idea?
It can be. I mean, just because it's at a farmer's market, it doesn't mean they're not that. So it's always a good question to ask, right? Like, because there are folks who set up the farmer's market and they're just basically setting up shop from a food broker. So it's not even local food, but looks nice and right. That's another thing to ask. But even with that, it could be it may not, because the problem with organic certification in the state is that it's the certain standard of it is it's not a great standard and it's hard to get it and it's costly. So just because people don't have organic certification doesn't necessarily mean it's not organic itself.
What's the definition? Without chemicals?
Well, see, that's the thing with the state and federal. It's pretty vague, which means is that that's the main thing. It's not using like chemical fertilizer or chemical pesticides, but it doesn't take into consideration things like whether or not the area it's growing in, whether or not there's rotating crops and sustainable and all those, whether or not the water is treated. I mean, there's a whole bunch of variations that they don't usually take into it. So it's not a panacea that maybe we used to think that, oh, if it's organic, then great. So it's always good to ask those questions if you're buying stuff from a farmer. Like, okay, so are you certified, not certified? But if you're not, then what do you do in terms of, are you using animal manure and other kinds of compost, or do you get the city sludge that you use? Because that happens here. So the water treatment facility here in Grand Rapids that we use, right? About 8 months of the year, after they separate all of what's left over, which is called sludge. They like to call it biosolids. That's sort of the industry term because it sounds nicer, but it's sludge, right? Right. So 8 months of the year, they give it away to local farmers who want to spread it on their fields, which, well, yeah, I would question because there's probably heavy metals in it. Right, and everything else that, whatever pharmaceuticals we're putting in our bodies that we then, put back into the system usually ends up there. So that's another question to ask.
I heard a term. Does this make sense? Organic balsam.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but if
Yeah. Right. I brought in just a couple of these too. Again, these are just. I live with folks from Latin America, so we just refer to them as cebollitas. They're sort of like a spring scallion kind of thing, But they're really good sautéed, a little salt, they just melt in your mouth. But these, so these plants will grow crowns on them, right? If if you've grown onions or garlic or anything like that, or chives, whatever, they grow crowns on top of them, right? So in other words, you need to always save certain plants. So we have what we call parent plants that are the really big ones that grow the crowns, because the young plants, they'll also grow crowns if you let them go, but they don't get real big. So if you have the big plants and you have the big crowns, then you could eat them the next year easily. So I'm just going to pass some of these around. And if anybody wants to take any of these, they can have them. These are just because we've got hundreds and hundreds of them. But so that's another thing in terms of seed saving, and is that a lot of things will grow crowns. So it's just important to think about that, to not deplete all of your. So if you plant, if you planted 50 of these kinds of things, these sort of spring onions or whatnot, to not eat them all, unless you want to have to go out and buy another bag in the spring of bulbs to plant. But you don't need to do that if you don't want to. If you saved a certain percentage and let them crown, you can harvest them in the fall and plant them in the fall, so that by next spring you could eat them again. So there's so many things that are like that. Does anybody grow Jerusalem artichokes and maybe wish they didn't, but there's just grow. Anybody grow Jerusalem artichokes? J-chokes? Nobody? Yeah? Yeah, they're really prolific. Well, we have a ton too, if anybody wants any, but they're really good. I mean, it's a tuber, it's a root plant. They're kind of like a cross between a potato and a radish, whatever. But you can eat them raw with or a little salt, or you can saute them, or people put them in salads. And they're very nutrient rich. They're not very big necessarily, but they spread like crazy. So they're very self-regenerative. So it's always good if you're going to plant them. If you can sort of plant them in somewhat of a contained area, otherwise they'll just sort of take over. But they get this really beautiful, like 5-6 foot tall stalk that has looks like a small sunflower on the top of it. But you pick them in the spring. So, we just in the last few days we started digging some up to eat, because now the ground's not frozen anymore, and they're just really, really good at this point up for the next month. They not necessarily, but they, once they, starting in like late May, you don't want to pick them to eat them because they get really tough then. But that's when they start not only growing above ground, they start spreading underground. So what spread during the summer is what you pick in the early spring. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions about any other particular variety save? How many people do herbs? Okay. And so what about, do people have any questions about seed saving with herbs? Or how much luck do people have with saving seed? Yeah. Well, the same thing. They'll grow a crown on them. So just save the crown. So if you, yeah, oh yeah, they're prolific. Yeah. Yeah, so just let some of them crown. If you want to plant more, just let them crown, and then you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. It's a tough one. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because we're a little fortunate because we have our own greenhouse that we build on the side of the house. So we've been able to, not always, but have been reasonably successful of starting lavender from seed in the greenhouse. It's always, the problem is having enough the best conditions for them to sort of flourish. So we've actually had better luck growing it in pots than we had just planting it in kind of the herb garden area. Absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah. Good. Pardon me? That's what we've had better luck with, as opposed to direct seeding outside. Doesn't mean that other people might not work. I mean, that's the thing about it. I mean, obviously, everybody's space is a little different, and you're going to know your space. The more you spend in your space, the more you're going to know what's going to work in terms of sunlight and what's in the soil and all those kinds of things, what works better where. Does anybody grow fruit? What do you grow? Ooh, okay, all right. And so, how do you get them to to regenerate? What do they do? They just take over, right? Right, right. So it's not a question that you have to like save seeds from the fruit. I mean, you can do that, not so easy. And it's not a question that you figure out a way to sort of separate stuff. If you just save a bunch of the fruit, and then you can just, you could bury it, right? And stuff will come. But because the plants are so prolific, how they get long, and then they eventually grow, and then they stick in the ground and start new shoots, so forth. So,
Is that what a strawberry does?
no, not so much. I mean, it's not that it's not possible, but strawberry plants, they send out shoots, and they send out new shoots. So it's just it's going to vary with stuff, and that's the thing. That's always, I mean, doing it is the best teacher, right? As opposed. Yeah, it is. But the new shoots provide for growing, more plants with flowers, right? So you don't need to take the fruit itself for it to be regenerative. You just need to make sure that the plants are well kept and have space to run. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So the seed, the berry,
Yeah.
ripen to the rock,
Yeah. Right.
or it will,
Yep.
it's like a fermentation.
Yep. Yep. I mean, it's the thing with all this stuff. I mean, you have to make sure that its stuff is fully ripe for the seed to be fully mature to be regenerative.
Let a strawberry go.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we just have a tendency to want to like pick everything, right, and eat it right away, right? Which, yeah, it's hard not to want to do that when you're out doing that, because that homegrown strawberries are just so different than store-bought strawberries, right? I mean, the flavor, the texture, I mean, everything is just, yeah. I think strawberries are particularly evident. Okay, I'm going to pass around if anybody's interested, and I brought extra bags. Yeah, Lisa. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the. Yes. Well, we grow two different kinds of basil, and both of them are pretty good. Again, it's a matter of leaving them alone to go to seed. That they get a. The leaves will eventually, there'll be less of them, and the stalk will grow with the flowers, and you just have to let them go on. So they have these little cluster pods that are sort of around the stem, and you have to let them brown, and they're just very small black seeds in there. But you don't need to separate them. I mean, you can if you want to, but you don't need to. So we just snip them, and I just strip those little clustered sort of husks from the stem into a jar or some kind of container. And then I just plant the whole thing. I don't try to separate them from the husk because it's nice, natural, little extra compost when you do plant them. And we've had luck with both of them, both the sort of the basil that people are most familiar with, as well as the Japanese version that we also grow, which has just a kind of a different flavor to it. But yes.
Going back to the original discussion, we bought a basil plant, I don't know where it came from, and I loved it, and saved the seed from it. What are my chances that it's going to
Yeah, it's 50-50, right. With these days, where it's at, it's always hard to know, particularly if you bought the plant, because it's like, well, I don't know where the seeds are from. So it's always worth trying it. It's worth trying with anything you buy, any fruit or vegetable or herb that you buy. It's worth trying it to see whether or not it will seed. But the thing is that if you are saving seeds and you have heirloom varieties, you want to make sure you keep them away from each other, because otherwise they'll infect the heirloom versions. If they are sort of a commercial hybridization, or if it's a GMO, you just don't want them to, because they'll take them over, unfortunately. So I'm just going to pass around quick if people want it. These are heirloom and organic collard greens. Anybody? Any collard green eaters in here? Yay. All right. Yeah. I mean, you have to, I think, acquire a taste for collards, but I think partly it's in the preparation. But I brought a bunch of these little extra seed bags that we use. So if you really want to take some out, feel free. I mean, there's probably 1,000 seeds just in this little bag here. So if you want to take some, feel free. But the thing with seed saving, it's sort of like what I learned from somebody who taught me how to juggle years ago. If you're going to do this, you have to promise you're going to share some of these with somebody else. If you're going to take them, you have to share. Okay. Okay. Yes. Well, I don't permanently have them in these. I mean, I put them in these for today's purpose. Yeah, I don't keep them in that. No. I have mostly sort of like, just collected from like over the years, like little glass spice jars, right? That's what I use mostly, right? Because they all have the holes in the top, so there's ventilation. And one thing I forgot to mention that another mechanism for seed storage that you could use is freezing them. You can also freeze them. Again, make sure they're dry before you freeze them. Don't freeze them, put them in the freezer when they're wet yet. But once they've fully dried, if you want to freeze them, you can also do that. That's another way for storage. And some people sort of swear by that's the best mechanism. We've done it a little bit, not a lot, but so freezing is another tool. And it doesn't really matter what kind of container you put it in, as long as it's dry, it's frozen. Yeah. For years and years, as a preserving mechanism, it's for as long as you want to keep them. So, and it's always good then when you do save seeds from year to year. Let's just say you have 50 zucchini seeds, right? Don't plant them all. It's always good to keep some from like an original stock behind. So each year you do that. And another good thing to do is, so let's say, because for things where they're really prolific, like a pepper plant. So let's say like, okay, I opened up my jalapeno pepper and there was, 75 seeds in that one pepper, that's not uncommon. You think, okay, I got plenty of jalapenos, I don't want any more. It's always good to get seeds from more than one vegetable, one fruit. So get from multiple. So even if you think like, oh, I got plenty, get them from more than one plant, because if there's some, if there's some virus or some bacteria that happen to be in that one, you just can't see it or whatever, you're going to lose them all. So it's good to have, again, variety is always the best thing here, to not have like just the same thing of anything. Okay. Well, quickly, I wanted to just mention, so I mentioned Seed Savers as an entity. So this is just their catalog. So it's just seedsavers.org. And you can not only buy seeds from them, you can actually buy plants, starters, if you wanted to, directly from them. Again, of fruits, vegetables, herbs, and flowers. They have all. Another good one is just Seeds of Change. It's just seedsofchange.org is another. Those are the two, one that not only are interested in promoting this, but also have, I think, really good consciousness about this whole idea of why we should save seeds. Seedsavers.org and Seeds of Change. And then there's just worth looking at this. I'm going to end this and then I'll let Sarah come back here and make some announcements. This is the organization that Vandana Shiva is a part of, called Navdanya, which is Indian term for saving. It's not up there. How to get this back on, Sarah? It went to sleep, I guess. The reason why I'm pointing to this is because it's a really informative website, and it's sort of a women's collective that started several years ago around saving seeds and doing other kinds of things. Because starting in the late 1990s, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, basically passed sort of as a global standard that saving seeds was not legal. So Indian farmers in particular have been at the forefront of kind of resisting that. And we're not the only, there's plenty of countries doing it, but Indian farmers have been at the forefront of kind of resisting this. So like in India, I mean, how many of you eat or cook with millet? Okay, so yeah. you know, I think it's a great alternative grain to like not just always eating rice or pasta or whatnot. But in India, there are literally about 80 different varieties of millet that still exist. But because, again, particularly Cargill is trying to kind of hybridize and GMO sort of millet, if these folks weren't doing what they're doing to save and fight back, you know, they may eliminate most of the varieties of millet in the next, you know, the next decade. And then just one last thing, and not to freak people out or anything, but in January of this year, the U.S. government, the Obama administration signed into law, I always think this name is really funny, although it's not funny what they're doing. It's called the Food Safety Modernization Act. Signed into law in January. And it's sort of a revamping of our food policies in general. But one of the things that it says, a provision in that, is that to save seeds from your own garden is a criminal act. It's criminalized. Yeah. So if you just Googled, right, or did a search or went to the White House or any of those sites, food modernization, it's a crazy term, right? Food Safety Modernization Act, right? Sounds like it's good for us, but it's a bunch of those things that are not. So I just have been encouraging you all to break the law here today. And I hope you do, because we need to save seeds, you know. I mean, obviously it's an issue of enforcement, but just so you know that, and again, the reason why that was passed is because companies like Monsanto and Cargill were lobbying heavy for that to be included as part of the new legislation. So I don't know. I mean, they're not. People aren't going to start showing up at your door saying, "Are you saving seeds?" You know, or whatever. But I think it's important to just recognize that it's a reality, because you know, if we want to have any kind of control over our own food systems, you know, saving seeds is a pretty basic one, and we should be able to do that. You know, yes.
So what organizations are working to rescind that Food Safety Modernization Act?
You know, there's a variety of groups in the country that do. Seed Savers is certainly one of them that's doing that. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't kind of like give you a list, but I could if you wanted to get a hold of me. I could give you a list if you really wanted to look at that. So I'm going to give you my email, and I'm going to give it to Sarah. So it's just jsmith@griid.org. jsmith@griid.org. iid.org. Grid, it's grid. I do media work, so that's that sort of thing. But that's also my email address. So if you want information about that, and if you want to keep a conversation going about seeds and seed saving and swapping and sharing, I'd love to see what varieties you have, and we could share and swap and do all that good stuff. That'd be great. So.
You said they're starting a local seed bank.
Yes.
Do you have any more information about that? Or
Lisa, can you give them your contact information about that? The seed bank. She was asking about the local seed bank. Can they contact you about that?
My email address is Lisa, S is in Sam, K is in King, the number 1, at AOL.com.
Lisa SK1 at AOL.com. Lisa SK1 at AOL.com.
Starter plants from the places that Jeff has talked about. So if you want to use the starter
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, just a couple things before you go. We're actually going to get out of here on time today. That might be a first for Root Camp. At the beginning of the session, I said the April and May sessions are not held in this room or in this building. The April session will be held at the ATC in room 130. The ATC is the building down on GRCC's main campus that's on the corner of Fountain and Ransom. And at the April session, Anya Mast from Trillium Farms is going to be the speaker, and she'll. That sounds like April, so that sounds like it's really getting ready to put this stuff in the ground. The May session will also be on the main campus, and I don't know right now what room that's in, but somebody does, but I don't have that up here. So next week we're not meeting up here. Okay, two other things then. On the table when you came in, there were 2 flyers. One is this Root Camp Boot Camp flyer, another is the Garbage Tour flyer. Amanda Cook here from Graphics actually did these lovely flyers for us here at GRCC. This boot camp is an a 10-hour gardening workshop scheduled in April 15th and 16th, I think. That will be held at the ATC at that same building. The how this is laid out is that there's a 3-hour block on Friday evening, and then Saturday during the day. This workshop will be held mostly at the ATC, but Tom will be using the garden up at the McCabe Marlowe House too. So at least one time on Saturday, you're going to walk up to the garden that's at the corner of Fountain and Lafayette, right? Okay, so you can find any of these under grcc.edu workforce training, and then there is a category there that's gardening and community agriculture, and this is listed there. Or you can call 234, I said 234-3600 before, which is a good number, but a better number is 234-3400 for this or the next one I'm talking about. So here Tom's going to focus on getting you ready. In that 10 hours, his focus is to get you ready to go home on Saturday afternoon and turn the sod over and have you confident to put your garden in for the year, right? But I'm sure if you've already done that, there's plenty that you can get from that 10 hours of discussion with Tom. Okay, the other one that I want to just point to really quickly before I let you go is this. This is a really cool graphic brought to you by Amanda. And this is also kind of coming from this same conversation, all of which started at the Keller Future Center last year. This is called the Greater Grand Rapids Garbage Tour. Being around GRCC, you become very aware that we have a remarkable lack of knowledge about recycling, about garbage in general, about all this conversation. This isn't directed at gardening, but it's definitely directed at a piece of it, right? So this tour, it's like a field trip. It's like that field trip that you wish you had, but we don't get to go on anymore. It's an afternoon from 1 to 5, starting at the Tassel MTech, and we'll take a bus to the South Kent landfill. And if you're on a bus, you can go into the landfill. And if you're on a bus, so the landfill personnel will come onto the bus with us, and they'll take us on a tour of the landfill. So we get to go up onto that big heap of garbage. To me, this sounds fun. This sounds really cool to me. And then from there, this is all in 4 hours on the bus. Then from there, I think we go to the incinerator might be next, in which case we'll get off the bus, and he'll talk about how at the incinerator, which is on Market Street, how at the incinerator they take our waste here and turn it into electricity. So that's a big piece of this picture too. In Grand Rapids, that's a big piece of the waste management picture, is this incinerator. The other piece, another big piece, is the new recycling facility. So we'll also stop at the recycling facility, and they'll give us the 50-minute, and we'll get off the bus, and in the recycling facility we'll get how all this is handled in that single stream recycling. So this is a field trip from 1 to 5, starting at the Tassel MTech. More information, 234-3400, or online, still in that community, whatever that was called, community gardening and agriculture, gardening and community agriculture under workforce training. I hope that we see you there. I look forward to seeing you in May. Thanks so much for coming. You can leave these evaluations on the tables. Thanks. Have fun.